original bio of Steve Smale, and he's going to focus, I believe, by the title, on what happened in Michigan when Steve was a student, both undergraduate and graduate. And I think we heard this morning some of the seeds of Steve's political activity from his sister, right? From his sister communicated how his father was, right? And so, like father, like son. And you're going to Steve Batterson from Emory University. That's what it's called. Great. And Steve might drop in. I think what happened is he partied too much last night. And he's not used to that these years, I think. I don't know, but maybe. But he'll drop in. Yeah.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Oh, gosh.
Beautifully. So I'd like to share a memory from Steve's 70th birthday conference in Hong Kong with this picture of him, me, and our late friend Bob Williams. And I'll begin my talk by defining McCarthyism to be a period in the United States from the late 1940s through the 1950s characterized by political repression and persecution of left-wing individuals. And note that the McCarthyism interval contains the years that Steve and Chandler Davis were at the University of Michigan. Steve was an undergraduate and graduate student at Michigan from 1948 to 1956. Chandler was an instructor in the math department from 1950 to 1954. Now, to provide some background, let's consider those times in the context of world events. The Cold War was well underway when Steve arrived in Ann Arbor. Stalin had just seized control of Czechoslovakia and imposed a blockade on Berlin. In 1949, Mao took over China, and the Soviets successfully tested an atom bomb. The following year, Klaus Fuchs confessed to spying on the Manhattan Project for the Soviet Union. And on February 9th, the then little-known Senator Joe McCarthy gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed to have a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. The speech alarmed Americans and drew attention to the senator. Then in June, the Korean War began. So all of these developments contributed to an environment ripe for the spread of McCarthyism. Now let's look at its roots. A key event took place in 1917. A few months prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, J. Edgar Hoover began work as a clerk in the Department of Justice. Hoover had just graduated from George Washington Law School, where he supported himself by cataloging new acquisitions at the Library of Congress. Hoover's first Justice Department assignments were to work in collaboration with the Bureau of Investigation, which in 1935 would be renamed Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. World War I was underway, and Hoover worked with the Bureau of Investigation to process enemy aliens for internment and deportation. Soon their attention expanded to include anarchists, communists, and radicals of all sorts, including citizens. The work suited Hoover well, and he rose rapidly through the ranks. When, in 1919, after a series of mysterious bombings, the Bureau of Investigation created a division to identify and keep tabs on radicals, the young Hoover was named as director of the branch. There he used the skills he had acquired at the Library of Congress to create an elaborate file system that he would assiduously maintain after becoming director of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924. Now, one problem that Hoover faced in going after radicals was that simply being a member of the Communist Party, or CPUSA, was not an explicit violation of any law. Nevertheless, for the remainder of his life, Hoover would wage a war against people he thought were members of the CPUSA. So Hoover and HUAC were the executive branch force behind McCarthyism, which at least one historian suggests might have been more aptly named Hooverism. On the legislative side, in 1938, the House of Representatives created a special committee to investigate the extent, character, and object of un-American activities in the U.S. Over the next several years, its demagogic chair, Martin Dees, led hearings and issued reports purporting to expose a sinister communist influence in New Deal policies and labor unions. The committee, which became permanent in 1945, was known as the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. So the federal force, early on, the federal forces against the left were HUAC and Hoover, which were actually operating in competition rather than as allies. Hoover did not cooperate with HUAC because he was territorial and believed that the FBI had the government concession to keep the left in line. He also worried that sharing intelligence with the publicity-hungry members of HUAC could compromise his sources and expose his illegal techniques that included break-ins, wiretaps, and buggings. On the other hand, he had all these files on people that he was unable to lock up. HUAC, for its part, lacked the investigative resources of the FBI, but held hearings in which they berated the leftists they knew about. After the Republicans gained control of Congress in the 1946 midterm elections, J. Parnell Thomas became the HUAC chair, and Thomas decided to focus HUAC's attention on the motion picture industry, which he believed was lousy with communists, and indeed, there were a number of leftists on both sides of the camera. So on June 24th, 1947, Thomas reached out to Hoover to propose an alliance. In this crucial meeting, Thomas persuaded Hoover to select intelligence to share with HUAC that would be used in hearings to expose the communist threat. It was the beginning of a productive relationship. HUAC immediately received information from the FBI about CPUSA members in Hollywood, including copies of membership cards that had been obtained in clandestine break-ins by the FBI to the CPUSA office in Los Angeles. This set up HUAC for what became known in 1947 as the Hollywood 10 hearings. HUAC subpoenaed people who were provably communist. Most were screenwriters such as Dalton Trumbo. The Hollywood 10 knew they would be asked what I call the communist question, that is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And the Hollywood 10 decided not to answer the question based on the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and assembly. The high-profile hearing showcased an intolerant chair ejecting belligerent witnesses, followed by the introduction into evidence of their CPUSA cards. The aftermath for the Hollywood 10 played out on parallel legal and professional tracks. On the legal side, the Supreme Court had never ruled on whether witnesses had a First Amendment right to refuse to answer the communist question. The Hollywood 10 were indicted were indicted for contempt of Congress and using information obtained by illegal FBI wiretaps on their attorneys, subsequently convicted in district court. In 1949, they lost on a unanimous ruling by a 3-judge panel in the Court of Appeals that held that the communist question was within the purview of Congress. The following year, their appeal to the Supreme Court only received 2 of the 4 votes required to hear the case. So each of the Hollywood 10 received a sentence from 6 months to a year. On the professional side, the movie moguls decided that the publicity was bad for their industry and created a blacklist banning uncooperative witnesses and CPUSA members from studio jobs. So for Hoover and HUAC, the outcome was ideal. Not only did the Hollywood 10 do time, but they became unemployable under their own names in Hollywood. So that was the legal aftermath, which wasn't so good. Hoover and HUAC were happy. The relationship continued. Hoover continued to share intelligence with HUAC that continued to hold hearings with an additional element of forcing admitted communists to name the names of other members. So to take prison off the table, the only options for red-tainted witnesses were to name names or invoke the Fifth Amendment. This is a horrible choice to have. For the FBI, naming names had the feature of making their list self-generating. And while the Fifth Amendment placed the witness beyond the reach of prosecution, Hollywood treated it as grounds for the blacklist. If similar actions were taken by authorities in other disciplines, then for HUAC, the witness's choice between naming names and taking the Fifth would become a heads I win, tails you lose. So that finally brings me to Michigan. So in 1954, a HUAC subcommittee conducted an investigation of communist activities in the state of Michigan. Using intelligence supplied by the FBI, 5 faculty and 2 economics graduate students were subpoenaed. The graduate students were Steve's apartment mate, Ed Schaefer, and the head of his communist branch, Myron Sharp. The faculty included economics lecturer Larry Klein, who would receive the 1980 Nobel Prize in economics. Klein was the only witness who cooperated with HUAC, and in return, he received a private hearing. Mathematician Nate Coburn had multiple sclerosis. Despite HUAC's suspicion that he might be faking, Coburn escaped having to testify. Clem Marquardt and Mark Nickerson had similar backgrounds. Both had been radicalized during the Depression and become active members of the CPUSA. Marquardt had even gone to Spain to fight in the Civil War. Marquardt and Nickerson were party members in graduate school. After becoming successful postdoctoral scientists, they reduced their political involvement, and since coming to Michigan, they were full-time scholars, no longer party members. Nickerson was a tenured associate professor of pharmacology. Marquardt was an assistant professor of zoology. Unwilling to name names, both reluctantly decided to plead the Fifth Amendment. Schaefer and Sharp, who were still party members, also took the Fifth, and that left Chandler. Chandler had joined his parents in the CPUSA after his freshman year at Harvard. Chandler was a member during his first few years in Ann Arbor, but left the party in 1953. Naming names was out of the question for Chandler, but taking the Fifth was objectionable for a personal reason. He had seen his father take the Fifth Amendment and be marginalized in the press as a Fifth Amendment communist. On the other hand, the principled stand of taking the First Amendment had failed in the courts for the Hollywood 10, but not gone beyond the appellate level. So Chandler reasoned that he might refine the First Amendment argument, reach the Supreme Court, and win for himself and others. It was an extremely high-risk gamble. Chandler was 27 years old, married with 1 child and another on the way. But with the full support of his wife, Natalie, who was then a graduate student in history at Michigan, Chandler decided to rely on the First Amendment. It was a courageous stance. The hearing took place in Flint on May 10th, 1954, and I believe Steve was actually there. You were there for the hearing, right? Afterward, only Chandler was indicted, and that gave him the standing to push the First Amendment issue in the courts. And that's a long story that went on for 5 years until a similar appeal was lost in the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote. So in 1960, Chandler served a 6-month sentence in federal prison. Now consider the hearing's outcome from the perspectives of Hoover and HUAC. that exposed 5 commies, but only meted out punishment to Chandler. To get at the other 4, they would need the help of outside authorities. And that's where the University of Michigan comes in. The president of the University of Michigan was Harlan Hatcher, who viewed the publicity as bad for the university. As soon as he heard about the hearings, he reached out to the subcommittee chair to offer his full cooperation. I'll look at the university's treatment of the faculty and graduate students separately. With the faculty, Chandler had met with Hatcher prior to the hearings, and Hatcher had tried unsuccessfully to persuade him to cooperate with the committee. Hatcher listened to a radio broadcast of the hearings and afterwards suspended the 3 faculty with pay pending an investigation. Hatcher really wanted to fire all 3 people, but first he sought cover from a faculty investigating committee. So in this committee's review, there was no reason to force anyone to name names. So this time Marquardt and Nickerson cooperated, forcefully responding about their communist priors. Chandler, on the other hand, again declined to discuss his political activity. Since being urged by Hatcher to cooperate, he'd come to view the university as an appendage of HUAC. The investigating committee, for its part, regarded current communist membership as grounds for dismissal and felt that it was incumbent on the faculty to be candid about their current and past CPUSA relationships. The committee met with representatives from the 3 affected departments. Zoology and mathematics were very supportive of Marquardt and Chandler. Nickerson, however, had a long-standing conflict with his pharmacology chair in the medical school. It was a case of ambitious rising star versus established leader expecting deference. You may have seen it at other places. The committee also met with a HUAC staff member who told them that Chandler was in CPUSA. The committee unanimously recommended that Chandler be fired. With Marquardt and Nickerson, majority supported reinstatement. Hatcher decided to fire Chandler and Nickerson, keeping only Marquardt. So on the surface, this seemed strange because the cases of Marquardt and Nickerson were largely indistinguishable, except that Nickerson had tenure and was harder to dispose of. But the medical school wanted to dump Nickerson. And moreover, Marquardt's FBI files revealed that Hatcher's actual intention was to let Marquardt go the following year when his contract expired. There's more to this story that I don't have time to cover, but my main point is that HUAC could only directly punish Chandler, but through the university they could get at Marquardt and Nickerson too. What about the 2 graduate students who took the 5th? Hatcher left the decision on punishment to the economics faculty. In the report, they stated that the department believed that Marquardt and Schaefer were entitled to an opportunity to earn their PhDs. But, and I'm quoting, "We freely confess that individually we could not and will not recommend either of these men for teaching or research positions." So imagine you're in the middle of graduate school and the faculty has a meeting and they decide they're going to blacklist you after you finish the program. Neither Schaefer or Sharp was aware of this action until I told them 40 years later. And while both went on to successful careers in economics, neither received a PhD from Michigan. Sharp, after having drafts of his thesis repeatedly rejected by his advisors unsatisfactory, finally gave up, eventually founding an innovative publishing company in the social sciences. In the case of Schaefer, following the hearings, he lost his part-time jobs, forcing him to withdraw from graduate school. 8 years later, he submitted a thesis proposal to his advisor. After receiving a discouraging response from the graduate coordinator, Schaefer sought a second opinion from Columbia, where he received a fellowship and completed his PhD with his thesis being published in book form. And that brings me to Smale. Steve was not subpoenaed then, but could have been, and was a decade later. At least one Michigan administrator was very dismissive of Steve's capacity to influence others. In a 1952 letter from the Dean of Women to Hatcher, assessing the threats posed by various left-wing students on campus, she wrote, "Not the lisping chess club treasurer Smale, who goes to the East Berlin Peace Rally, is a danger to the university, but the extremely intelligent and controlled Ed Schaefer." If only she could be here now. 2 years later, a Michigan State police agent got the Dean of Men to have Steve's teaching assistantship terminated. As we know, Steve did go on to get his PhD with Raoul Bott. When he went on the job market, nothing materialized for quite a while. And then a beneficent professor tipped Steve off about the chair's recommendation that included the code words "quite active" in a liberal student group. Now, while understating how red Steve was at the time, in the McCarthy era, that phrase was enough to make him radioactive. So in closing, what I want to emphasize is the reach and perniciousness of McCarthyism. Hoover, HUAC, and McCarthy were constrained in which leftists they could persecute directly. For McCarthyism to be as effective as it was, required the complicity of Hollywood and other institutions. At Michigan, it was not just one or two extremists gone rogue, but rather it was a culture in which the president, the vice president, the dean of men, the dean of women, the economics faculty, the mathematics chair, all felt impelled to sabotage the careers of Nickerson, Marquardt, Schaefer, Sharp, and Smale. More details are available in my book about Chandler Davis. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thanks for that. That was amazing. So how did Steve get out of there? I mean, you know, how did he avoid the sabotage?
Well, he got a not so great job at Chicago, not in the math department, but in a liberal arts program, and then he inverted the spear, and you know that had currency that started him on the path that he wound up on. Do you want to say anything, Steve? Yeah, Lenore?
You want to comment on parallels to today? No, you don't have to.
That's too painful.
Okay. Enough said.
I don't want to get over my skis.
Yeah, enough said.
Or get the Simons Institute in trouble. Remember, these go out over the web.
Any other specific questions about Michigan? A lot of Michigan people here. Okay, but I think we have the big guns here, so. Okay, so our next talk